Have you ever wondered how well you truly know the people living next door? What lies behind their friendly smiles and casual greetings? While there are no definitive guidelines for identifying potentially dangerous individuals among your acquaintances, psychologists and investigators agree that those with psychopathic tendencies are more likely to commit violent crimes. If someone's behavior ever raises red flags, it's best to keep your distance. This unsettling case begins with Brian and Beverly Moak, a seemingly perfect couple whose life looked like a fairy tale. They were deeply in love, financially secure, and enjoyed traveling and spending time together. But everything changed when they moved into a new neighborhood. Not long after settling in, both Brian and Beverly were discovered lifeless in their home. Blood evidence at the scene led investigators straight to a nearby house. The motive behind this horrific act shocked even the most seasoned detectives. The love story of Brian and Beverly Moak. Brian and Beverly first met in the spring of 2001 at a mutual friend's party. At the time, they were both college students, but from the moment they locked eyes, it was clear they had found something special. What started as mutual admiration quickly deepened into a powerful connection, and they became inseparable. That summer, the couple took turns visiting each other's families, introducing their partners to their parents and openly sharing their serious intentions. Both families immediately approved of the relationship, noting how well the two complemented each other. Brian and Beverly had been lively and adventurous from a young age. They thrived on sports, excitement, and new experiences, never content to stay still for long. Beverly was a talented athlete who excelled in baseball and track, played guitar with ease, and had a passion for learning new languages. Her radiant smile could light up a room, and she was adored by her friends and peers alike. Brian had always been attracted to more dangerous and unconventional sports. He was passionate about rock climbing, surfing, and diving, and he loved taking risks. A true adventurer at heart, he saw danger not as a threat, but as a challenge he was always ready to face. Every year, he tried to visit a new place and learn a new skill. When Brian and Beverly first saw and spoke to each other, they immediately realized they were on the same wavelength. This became the starting point for their intense and fulfilling relationship. Together, they climbed mountains, skied and snowboarded, went scuba diving, and conquered waves and peaks alike. Despite their whirlwind romance and seemingly perfect relationship, the couple wasn't in a rush to get married. They both wanted to finish their education first. Once they graduated, they focused on saving for a house. Brian began building a career at an industrial company, and Beverly got a job as a hotel administrator, where her language skills were invaluable. On May 15th, 2006, the couple officially tied the knot. They held a beautiful ceremony by the ocean, inviting only their closest family and friends. Afterward, they went on a long honeymoon, visiting several countries. When they returned, Brian and Beverly purchased a spacious home in the quiet town of Graham in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. The house was located in a scenic and sparsely populated area near a forest and a river. It was a perfect place to start their family and enjoy a peaceful life. Brian worked as an engineer at a branch of a large industrial company, while Beverly focused on translation work and decided to pursue a second degree. The couple quickly got to know their neighbors and made friends in their new town. Unfortunately, their happy and carefree life didn't last long. A shocking crime in a peaceful neighborhood. On Saturday, November 17th, 2007, at around 8 a.m., Brian's friend Stephen arrived at the couple's house. The two had planned to go fishing that morning. Stephen knocked on the door but got no response. Thinking that Brian had probably overslept, Stephen knocked louder and waited, but the house was silent. Stephen decided to wait in his car for about 30 minutes, trying to call Brian repeatedly. However, his calls went unanswered. Frustrated and feeling a bit upset that his friend might have changed plans without telling him, Stephen eventually left to fish on his own, since he had all the necessary gear with him. Later that day, still unable to reach Brian or Beverly, Stephen decided to return to their house. Once again, there was no answer at the door. This time, Stephen decided to walk around the property and look through the windows. He was starting to feel uneasy. Brian was a responsible and punctual person who wouldn't just disappear without notifying anyone. When Stephen reached the garage, he looked through a small window and saw that the couple's car was parked inside. This made him even more anxious, but he tried to push away any bad thoughts. Moving to the living room window, he attempted to see inside, but as it was already getting dark outside and the house lights were off, it was hard to make anything out. What he could see, however, left him deeply alarmed. The TV was lying face down on the floor, and just beyond it, something large and unmoving was on the ground. Stephen rushed back to his car to grab his fishing flashlight, switched it on, and directed the beam into the living room. What he saw froze him in terror. On the floor lay two bodies, partially covered with a blanket that was soaked through with blood. One bare foot stuck out from one side, and a hand was visible on the other. Horrified, Stephen immediately called emergency services to report what he had seen. He waited for law enforcement to arrive, staying by the house of his friends. When officers arrived, Stephen was the first to be interviewed. He recounted everything he knew about the day and expressed deep regret that he hadn't checked the windows earlier that morning when neither Brian nor Beverly answered his knocks or calls. Examining the crime scene, the front door wasn't locked, nor was it forced open, which immediately raised suspicions. Inside, in the living room, the lifeless bodies of the homeowners were discovered. Both had been dead for at least 12 hours, based on initial observations. The cause of death was determined to be gunshot wounds inflicted by a large caliber weapon. Each victim had been shot 3 times, leaving no chance of survival. The precision of the attack indicated that the assailant was determined and deliberate. But why? There were no signs of theft. Personal belongings, cell phones, and even cash were untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. There were no signs of struggle, and apart from the gunshot wounds, the bodies showed no evidence of other injuries or aggression. Investigators were left with the chilling impression that this was either a calculated execution or a deeply personal act of vengeance. However, according to witnesses, the couple had no known enemies or unresolved conflicts. The bodies had been moved after the crime, as evidenced by drag marks smeared with blood across the floor. The perpetrator had clumsily attempted to clean up, leaving smeared blood trails and splatters on the walls and furniture, indicating where the victims had been during the attack. 6 spent shell casings were found at the scene. Surprisingly, the assailant hadn't bothered to collect them. Forensics later confirmed the shots had been fired from a .22 caliber revolver. Investigators concluded that both victims were shot with the same weapon and likely by a single perpetrator. The unbroken lock suggested that the couple had willingly let the visitor inside. Detectives theorized that Brian might have answered a knock at the door, recognized the visitor, and let them in. Perhaps he invited the person into the house and turned toward the living room, but as soon as he did, the assailant pulled out a firearm and fired 3 shots at close range into Brian's back. One bullet exited his body and struck the television screen, causing it to topple over onto the floor. The noise likely drew Beverly out of the bedroom. When she saw her husband lying in a pool of blood and the assailant standing nearby, she tried to run. Tragically, she didn't make it far before 3 shots struck her in the back, killing her in the hallway. Her body was later dragged into the living room and placed beside Brian's. Both victims were still wearing pajamas, suggesting the crime occurred early in the morning while they were asleep. Why the assailant had covered the bodies with a blanket remained a mystery. The incomplete cleanup. The drag marks on the floor were smeared as if someone had tried to clean them but only made the scene messier. A large blood stain near the bodies had been disturbed, as though someone had tried to sweep it away. Behind the couch, investigators found a plastic broom with a long handle, its bristles matted with dried blood. However, the perpetrator had meticulously wiped the broom handle clean of fingerprints, which explained why it had been left behind at the scene. It soon became clear why the broom had been used. The perpetrator had been trying to erase bloody shoe prints from the floor, scrubbing meticulously. Similarly, smudged fingerprints and palm prints were found on walls, furniture, and door handles, making identification impossible. Despite the assailants' efforts to clean up and obscure their tracks, seasoned forensic investigators knew that the longer a criminal stayed at the scene, the greater the chance of leaving behind something incriminating. Their instincts proved correct. On the blanket covering the victims' bodies, they found a critical clue: a partial boot print. The print wasn't obvious at first because it wasn't stained with blood. Instead, it was imprinted where the floor had only a light layer of blood, and the tread pattern appeared on the fabric beneath it. The blanket was sent to a lab, where forensic specialists identified the tread as belonging to a rare model of heavy-duty work boots with a distinctive sole pattern. Further investigation revealed that a construction company in Clearfield County had recently purchased several pairs of this exact boot. With this lead, investigators narrowed their list of potential suspects and began by questioning employees of the company. In addition to the shoe print, detectives found a palm print on one of the house's surfaces. It seemed like a breakthrough, and there was hope that the case would be solved in days. However, when the print was run through law enforcement databases, no matches were found. This suggested the perpetrator had no prior record and had never been fingerprinted by police. The first suspect. Naturally, the initial suspect was Stephen, the friend who had discovered the bodies and reported the crime to law enforcement. He had visited the crime scene twice that day, which raised suspicion. However, Stephen explained that he had assumed earlier in the morning that Brian and Beverly were simply asleep, which is why he didn't call the police until later. When Stephen realized he was a suspect, he was shocked and outraged. He claimed he had spent nearly the entire day fishing alone by the river, a location where no one else had seen him, meaning he had no alibi. Nevertheless, investigators used footage from traffic cameras to verify his timeline. The recordings confirmed that he had spent the day traveling to and from the fishing site as he had described. Fingerprint analysis further cleared Stephen. His prints didn't match any found at the scene, and tests for gunshot residue on his skin and clothing came back negative. Additionally, Stephen had no connection to the construction company that had purchased the boots, and the size of the boot prints didn't match his shoe size. With no evidence tying him to the crime, all suspicions against him were dropped. An unexpected witness. Meanwhile, detectives conducted extensive interviews with neighbors in hopes of finding witnesses. When they knocked on the door of Daniel and Jennifer Tabares, who lived across the street from the Mokes, they finally got a promising lead. Daniel answered the door and explained that his wife Jennifer was at work, but that he was willing to answer their questions. He revealed that around 5:30 a.m. on the day of the crime, he heard unusual sounds coming from the Mokes' home, loud noises that he now realized sounded like gunshots. Curious but cautious, Daniel had looked out his window and noticed a white pickup truck parked near the Mokes' house. He was certain the vehicle didn't belong to the couple. Minutes after the loud sounds were heard, two men exited the Mokes' house. The witness, Daniel Tabares, wasn't able to get a good look at them due to the low light just before dawn. However, he provided a detailed description of the driver of the white pickup truck parked near the house. According to Daniel, the driver was a white man around 40 years old, of solid build, with long, dark hair tied back in a ponytail and a mustache. He also noticed a tattoo on the man's left hand, though he couldn't make out the design. While this information seemed promising, no other neighbors reported seeing anything similar. Friends, family, and co-workers of Brian and Beverly couldn't identify anyone in their circle who matched this description or drove a truck like that. Furthermore, the vehicle didn't appear on any nearby traffic cameras, raising the possibility that the perpetrators had used a back road through the woods to avoid detection. The white pickup truck was listed in a county-wide alert, but no leads emerged. A new suspect emerges. During a conversation with detectives, Beverly's mother recalled that her daughter had mentioned a neighbor, Jeremy Flint, a couple of months before the crime. Jeremy, a 22-year-old man, had been on law enforcement's radar for dealing prohibited substances. His house was known for frequent visits by suspicious individuals, and other neighbors had spoken negatively about him. This led investigators to consider him as a potential suspect in the brutal double crime. When officers visited Jeremy's home, he wasn't there. Their initial thought was that he might have fled after committing the crime. Further questioning of neighbors revealed that shortly before the tragedy, Brian and Beverly had hosted a small party at their home. Jeremy, uninvited and under the influence of illicit substances, had shown up unexpectedly. Witnesses described his behavior as aggressive. He harassed some of the women, insulted guests, and stirred up conflicts. Eventually, he was forced to leave, but not before vowing that the couple would regret their actions. The next day, Brian and Beverly noticed several items missing from their home, including a cell phone and a gun with ammunition that had been stored in a drawer in their pantry. Certain that Jeremy was responsible, the couple decided to confront him. They went to his house and politely but firmly demanded their belongings back, warning him that they would go to the police if the items weren't returned. This impulsive threat, directed at someone with ties to criminal activities, could have been a dangerous mistake. Jeremy denied stealing anything and refused to return the items. However, the following day, the missing belongings mysteriously reappeared in the couple's backyard. Brian and Beverly were convinced that Jeremy had placed them there during the night. While the incident appeared resolved, Beverly remained uneasy. She grew fearful of being home alone and began urging her husband to consider moving to a different neighborhood. Jeremy's alibi. When Jeremy finally returned to town, law enforcement detained him immediately for questioning. However, it quickly became clear that he had been out of town for nearly a week, returning the day after the crime. He had traveled to another state to visit his parents and stayed with them for 6 days. His alibi was corroborated by numerous witnesses, and surveillance footage from a bar showed that he had been out drinking with friends on the night of the crime. Additionally, forensic analysis confirmed that Jeremy's fingerprints and palm prints didn't match those found at the scene. With no evidence tying him to the crime, Jeremy was ruled out as a suspect. New developments in the case. When investigators ran out of suspects and leads, they decided to revisit Daniel Tabares, the only witness in the case, hoping he might recall something new. During this follow-up visit, Daniel's story suddenly began to shift. He claimed to remember details about what the perpetrators were wearing and even described one of the men exiting the house, noting that he had a scar on his cheek. This was a surprising change, as Daniel had previously stated that the men's faces were obscured by hoodies. A detective asked Daniel to point out the window he had been looking through during the incident. The detective examined the view and noticed that while it was daytime, it was still difficult to make out details of someone across the street. Considering the events had taken place during the early morning twilight, it seemed improbable that Daniel could have seen so much. This discrepancy suggested that Daniel might have been lying all along, but why? Could he have been involved in the crime himself? When investigators asked to see Daniel's shoes, he produced several pairs of sneakers, boots, and dress shoes, none of which matched the footprint found at the scene. Still, his changing story and increasingly suspicious behavior prompted detectives to take a closer look at Daniel himself. A troubled past. Daniel Tabares' background turned out to be deeply unsettling. Born in 1966 as the youngest child in a military family, his life took a dark turn early on. When Daniel was just 4 years old, his parents divorced, leaving him and his 3 older sisters in the care of their mother. His father remarried soon after and showed little interest in his children from the previous marriage. By the 9th grade, Daniel had dropped out of school, begun running away from home, stealing, and experimenting with prohibited substances. At 18, he was arrested for robbery for the first time. However, his estranged father unexpectedly intervened, helping him avoid a prison sentence in favor of probation. It seemed the father, perhaps motivated by guilt, wanted to give Daniel another chance. Despite this, Daniel continued to have frequent run-ins with the law over the years. Each time, he received minimal sentences for his crimes. In the late 1980s, Daniel moved to Florida to live with his father, who attempted to support him. His father paid for an expensive treatment program at a private rehabilitation clinic and tried to help Daniel find steady employment. But within 6 months, Daniel was caught stealing and dealing substances again. This time, his father gave up and sent him back to live with his mother. By this point, Daniel's mental health had begun to deteriorate due to his dependencies. Within a year, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed medication. However, Daniel rarely took his medications as directed. Instead, he mixed them with alcohol, leading to aggressive and dangerous outbursts. A violent incident. In July 1991, during an argument with his mother, Daniel suddenly grabbed a knife and attacked her, inflicting nearly 30 wounds. She died at the scene. At his trial, Daniel claimed he had acted under the influence of voices in his head, which he said had ordered him to kill her. However, court-appointed psychiatrists determined that Daniel had been aware of his actions and was therefore legally responsible. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Despite this sentence, Daniel was released on parole in 2006, having served less than the full term. While serving his prison sentence, Daniel Tabares began corresponding with Jennifer Freitas, and the two developed a romantic relationship. Jennifer waited for his release, and as soon as he was paroled, they married. Daniel moved into her home in the small town of Graham, arriving around the same time as the Moak couple. By relocating to a different state, Daniel violated the terms of his parole. He should have been arrested immediately, but a combination of police negligence and a technical error prevented that from happening. Somehow, Daniel's fingerprints were accidentally removed from the criminal database, which allowed him to evade detection, even after investigators found a bloody handprint at the Moak's crime scene. It seemed as though every factor was inexplicably working in his favor. Further investigation revealed that Daniel had briefly worked at a construction company that had purchased the rare work boots linked to the crime. However, detectives lacked concrete evidence to make an arrest. They needed to build their case carefully to avoid alerting Daniel or his potential accomplice, Jennifer. Setting the trap. On November 24, 2007, Daniel was invited to the police station under the pretense of assisting in creating composite sketches of potential suspects. He eagerly agreed and spent about an hour enthusiastically describing and helping draw portraits of people he had completely fabricated. While he was busy, another officer entered the room and casually mentioned that they needed to collect Daniel's fingerprints to rule him out as a suspect. Daniel hesitated but ultimately agreed, confident that no traces of his presence remained at the crime scene. After fingerprinting, the officer casually remarked that investigators had found an unknown bloody handprint at the Moaks house. Daniel visibly tensed and began explaining that he had been friendly with the Moaks and often visited their home, where his prints could have been left. The officer responded calmly, noting that there was no need to worry. After all, the handprint was bloody and clearly belonged to the perpetrator. A second detective then shifted the conversation to Daniel's past. He brought up the crime for which Daniel had served time, prompting Daniel to admit that he had killed his mother. Unexpectedly, Daniel began recounting the disturbing details of that crime, speaking with a chilling enthusiasm. He smiled as he described what he had done, exuding the aura of a true psychopath. Meanwhile, forensic specialists were comparing Daniel's prints to those found at the crime scene. When the results came back as a perfect match, detectives confronted Daniel with the evidence. His smug demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by rage. But before he could lash out, officers secured him in handcuffs and placed him under arrest. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, Daniel had no choice but to confess and cooperate with investigators. He explained that on the night before the crime, he had spent hours at a bar drinking and using strong substances. When he ran out of money to pay his tab, the bar staff threw him out, threatening to call the police. In a fit of rage, Daniel Tabares suddenly recalled that he had given his neighbor, Brian Moak, a tattoo the previous month as a friendly gesture. However, Daniel decided that he was owed payment for his work and arbitrarily demanded $50 for the service. Armed with his revolver, he showed up at the Moaks' house at 5 a.m., while the couple was still asleep. Brian, annoyed by the early visit, opened the door and was immediately confronted with Daniel's demand for money. Confused and frustrated, Brian refused, telling Daniel to come back after he'd sobered up. But Daniel was insistent. To defuse the situation, Brian decided it was easier to pay and headed to another room to retrieve the money. As he walked away, he made a remark that Daniel found offensive. This triggered Daniel's fury. In a split-second decision, he drew his gun and fired 3 shots into Brian's back. The sound of gunfire woke Beverly, who came out to investigate. She saw her husband lying on the floor in a pool of blood and Daniel standing over him with a gun. Realizing the danger, she tried to run back to the bedroom but was shot 3 times in the back before she could escape. After realizing the gravity of what he had done, Daniel went home and enlisted his wife, Jennifer, to help clean up the crime scene. Disturbingly, Jennifer didn't seem surprised by his actions. Together, they moved Beverly's body into the living room, placing it beside Brian, and covered both with a blanket. It was Jennifer who suggested using a broom to erase the bloody footprints. She also meticulously wiped down surfaces to remove fingerprints, though she missed one crucial handprint. Once the cleaning was done, Daniel disposed of the murder weapon by throwing it into a nearby river. Despite extensive efforts by investigators, the revolver was never recovered. Daniel Tabares was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His wife, Jennifer, expressed deep remorse, claiming she had helped Daniel out of fear for her own safety. She was sentenced to just 1 year in prison for tampering with evidence. In 2015, new homeowners renovating the property where Daniel had once lived with his mother made a horrifying discovery. While excavating the backyard, they unearthed human remains. Forensic analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to a young neighbor who had gone missing in 1990. Investigators determined that Daniel had been romantically interested in the woman, but after she rejected his advances, he reacted with lethal aggression. He buried her body in his mother's backyard, where it remained hidden for decades. This crime resulted in Daniel receiving a second life sentence.